Hello everyone, this is an addendum to the Blademaster devotion video. This is more to specifically explain two specific points of devotion. Now, a user named Huesitos, or I am Huesitos, I think it's I'm Huesitos, made a couple of observations that are very much worth addressing. I will address them chronologically. Okay? Now, the first thing that Huesitos mentioned was my use of Ghoul's Hunger on Fighting Spirit. Now, Huesitos makes a very good point, something that I did not fully... We're going to just go on ahead and maximize Fighting Spirit here for a second. Huesitos mentioned that advising people to use Ghoul's Hunger attached to Fighting Spirit is incorrect because for passively triggering devotion skills, such as Ghoulish Hunger, you should always be looking to have them attached to permanently on passives. For example, in this particular argument, you would want Ghoul's Hunger always attached to, say, Veil of Shadow. Normally, I agree. There is a specific difference with Ghoul's Hunger that I'm going to address here. Now, I addressed this in a comment originally, responding to Huesitos, but then Huesitos commented and it required a whole video. But Ghoulish Hunger automatically triggers guaranteed 100% chance whenever you are below 45% health, right? Now, below 45% health, it is not exactly at 45% health, because Ghoulish Hunger will trigger if you take, say, for example, you get hit and you go from 60% of your health down to 40%, say. Let's just say you take that much damage, right? You go below 45% health. Ghoulish Hunger will still trigger. Now, Huesitos' argument is that with an always-on skill, such as Veil of Shadow, you will automatically trigger this whenever you are below 45% health. Whereas with Fighting Spirit, you will only automatically trigger this whenever Fighting Spirit triggers below 45% health, which is very true. But Fighting Spirit, of course, has a 40% chance of activating each time you are hit, regardless of how much damage that hit does. The reason I like to attach Ghoulish Hunger to Fighting Spirit is because by tying Ghoulish Hunger to Fighting Spirit, anytime Fighting Spirit activates under 45% health, Ghoulish Hunger will simultaneously also activate, every time guaranteed. Which means you are getting the benefit of the 200% damage and the 235 offensive ability on Ghoulish Hunger. Rather than, potentially, which has been my experience, rather than potentially having Ghoulish Hunger activate and then Fighting Spirit activating a little while afterwards, either partially through Ghoulish Hunger, which only lasts 5 seconds, or after the Ghoulish Hunger effect has already ended. Keep in mind, Ghoulish Hunger has a 30-second recharge, so once Ghoulish Hunger activates, you're not going to see that again for another 30 seconds, which can be a very long time in the midst of particularly difficult combat. By tying this to Fighting Spirit, when you need it, when you fall under that 45% health, and Fighting Spirit activates under that threshold, guaranteed Ghoulish Hunger at the same time. If you attach this to something like Veil of Shadow, you are going to potentially see Ghoulish Hunger activate before Fighting Spirit and not getting the full benefits of Fighting Spirit out of this. Now, Huesitos mentions that the 200% to all damage is not the best part of Fighting Spirit, the offensive ability is. This partially depends on the build and partially depends upon your personal perspective. I think both are equally important in my eyes. The offensive ability is increasing your likelihood of not only landing hits, but also of getting critical hits, which obviously benefits Ghoulish Hunger, and the 200% to all damage simultaneously also benefits Ghoulish Hunger, especially with an increase in the 22% attack speed, meaning you are more likely to generate critical hits with the increased attack speed and the offensive ability, and you will just be straight out dealing more damage because you have the increased attack speed and the 200% to all damage. The point here is that by tying Ghoulish Hunger to Fighting Spirit, you are guaranteeing that if you need Ghoulish Hunger because you are under 45% health and Fighting Spirit triggers, which on average will trigger every 3 or so hits, statistically speaking. That's obviously not going to be specific. Don't use this as a specific measurement. But you have a 40% chance of activating this at max ranks, which I, of course, recommend for Fighting Spirit anyways. And so you're extremely unlikely to fall under the 45% threshold and die before you get Fighting Spirit / Ghoulish Hunger activated, unless you are playing both hardcore and on a mod that drastically increases enemy stats. The point here is that Huesitos mentions that you might miss procs of Ghoulish Hunger. This is unlikely even if you have it on a always-on skill like Veil of Shadow, because Ghoulish Hunger, again, only ever activates under 45% health. So, by, again, tying this to Fighting Spirit, you are guaranteeing that every time Ghoulish Hunger activates, you are getting all of the benefits of Fighting Spirit at the exact same time. This is why, very specifically, for Ghoulish Hunger, I make an exception. Normally, I agree with Huesitos. Alright? Normally, for passively activating devotion skills, you do usually want to assign them to always-on skills. Ghoulish Hunger, in regards to Fighting Spirit, I use as an exception, because when I have Ghoulish Hunger triggering, I want to be maximizing the amount of damage I'm doing at that time, so that way I can maximize the healing, because the big draw of Ghoulish Hunger here is the 80% of your attack damage being converted. That's a big reason why people like this. Yes, the physical resistance is really strong, yes, the attack speed is really nice, but that 80% attack damage is why most people that I know of are approaching Ghoulish Hunger. Okay? Because you can get physical resistance from other constellations. So I want the two to trigger simultaneously, and in order to guarantee that, you assign Ghoulish Hunger to Fighting Spirit. Now, Huesitos is, of course, totally free to disagree with this, and that's totally their right. But I have personally found, through my experience, that tying Ghoulish Hunger to Fighting Spirit is more effective, because when you need Ghoulish Hunger, boom, Fighting Spirit activates, Ghoulish Hunger will activate, you're golden. There are rare scenarios I have encountered, just to be open and honest, and because I'm hoping that Huesitos will mention this as well, if they're in good faith, that this does mean that against particularly difficult enemies, there is entirely the chance that they'll knock you out in 3 blows, and where with a always-on skill, you might have Ghoulish Hunger activate and be able to save yourself with Fighting Spirit. If you're cursed, Fighting Spirit might not activate and you'll never get Ghoulish Hunger. This is entirely possible, and has happened to me a handful of times. I have no problem admitting that. But, in most scenarios, I have found Fighting Spirit to be better used as the assigned skill for Ghoulish Hunger, rather than something always-on. If you prefer the always-on, that is fine. My personal preference and my recommendation is to assign Ghoulish Hunger to Fighting Spirit. I stand by this for the reasoning I have listed here. Second point is Huesitos also mentions that I mentioned that Giant's Blood I mentioned as being assigned to Pneumatic Burst. Pneumatic Burst is an activatable skill with a duration afterwards. And again, at first glance, this might be the same case, but technically Pneumatic Burst is very easy to make an always-on skill. Alright? It has a 24-second duration with only an 8-second skill recharge. Pneumatic Burst, once you activate it, is supremely easy to keep always on. It only costs 36 energy per activation, and there's no reason to not have this always active. You have triple its recharge time in terms of duration, so you don't even need to be using this every 8 seconds. You can wait 16 seconds. You can wait 20 seconds. Pneumatic Burst, while technically an activatable skill, is functionally a passive skill that heals you every 8 seconds minimum. Okay, again, normally I would agree with Huesitos on this point. But for Pneumatic Burst, because of the extremely short skill recharge, and the extremely long duration in comparison, this really is not a problem in this specific case. Although Hesitos does have a point here in that because this is officially an activatable skill, if you forget to re-trigger Pneumatic Burst, you do lose the possibility of having Giant's Blood activate. But I used Pneumatic Burst in that context specifically as an example. I don't always use Giant's Blood. When I do like to put it onto Pneumatic Burst when I have this. But what if we're doing a cold poison build and you're not dual wielding? Because I recommend very specifically for Pneumatic Burst to be used in the dual wielding scenario. If you recall, I also specifically mention that I use Menhir's Will when I'm not dual wielding. If I'm using a two-handed weapon or I'm using a shield, I go for Menhir's Will. And obviously, you don't want Giant's Blood assigned to Menhir's Will. It is an option here, alright? But you don't really want that to be, you don't want that assigned to Menhir's Will because Menhir's Will only activates when your health drops below a third. You absolutely will be missing potential triggers of Giant's Blood because Giant's Blood is just 15% chance when hit at any health level, unlike Ghoul's Hunger, which only activates under 45% health. Giant's Blood can activate at any given moment. So we don't want that on Menhir's Will, right? In a non-dual wielding scenario, I would recommend you put this on Veil of Shadow. Okay? I use Pneumatic Burst here, again, as more of an example. And when I'm dual wielding, I do attach Giant's Blood to Pneumatic Burst. I like to tie together my healing. That's a me thing. Okay? But the potential of missing triggers only happens if you forget to refresh this, which again is going to depend on the individual. But in non-dual wielding scenarios, I do assign this to Veil of Shadow. I did forget to mention this. This is on me. I failed to explain that properly. I failed to explain why I prefer Fighting Spirit as the tied skill to Ghoulish Hunger. This is not a random recommendation. This is something I personally find more effective than putting it onto a permanent skill. But that exception only applies to Ghoulish Hunger, specifically because Ghoulish Hunger is a guaranteed proc under a certain health threshold. This is not the case for Giant's Blood. I would not recommend assigning Giant's Blood to Fighting Spirit because you absolutely would miss procs with that, right? 100%. But Ghoulish Hunger, you're not going to miss that many procs, if any at all. Again, unless you're unusually cursed. Is it a little riskier? Yes. But in most of the cases, from my personal experience, this is my preference. Okay? I stand by this. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, and I expect that Huesitos will be watching/listening to this. Your preference is your own. That is fine. And if you, as a new player, find that this does not work for you, absolutely assign it to a permanent skill, of course. What I list here are only what I have found effective from my personal experience and what I personally like to do on these approaches. You don't have to follow these. This is not gospel. It's just my recommendation. I do encourage you to try this if you ever build like this. I encourage you to give it a try. I think you will find it very effective. I think you will find that when you need Ghoulish Hunger, when you're under 45% health, when you're at 30% health, when you're at 25% health, and Fighting Spirit activates, boom, there's also Ghoulish Hunger, and now you're healing back. You're clawing your way back from the brink. And it's not only feels glorious, but it's extremely effective. Again, I find it pretty consistent. I find it consistent enough for my purposes. Is it guaranteed to work every time? No, of course not. But I find it more effective. But with that being said, thank you all very much for listening. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.